This is section 1.6. We're skipping section 1.5 and I will go back to that in a later video. But right now we're just looking at section 1.6 and it's on multiplying integers. And so we're going to think back to when we learned how to multiply, and remember multiplying is in groups. So you're making groups of different numbers. It is crucial that you memorize your multiplication facts through at least 10, preferably 12. You should know 1 times 1, 1 times 2, 1 times 3, all the way up, 2 times 1, 2 times 2, 2 times 3, all the way up to 10 times 10. There are flashcards you can buy. I like to go to the dollar store, so you can get some flashcards at the dollar store for multiplication, and just go through them as you have time and make sure you know all your multiplication facts. There's digital flashcards. There's lots of different apps and programs, and you can do digital flashcards, but you can just go to the dollar store, get a pack of flashcards, and make sure you know those multiplication facts. Multiplication can be written several different ways. Multiplication probably has the most different number of ways to write the same operation. So the first time we learned multiplication, we learned the little x, 4 times 5. But when we get to algebra and we get to solving, that x means something different. So we don't see that very much in this class. Another way to write it is the dot, 4.5. That's another thing that means multiplication. I usually write the star, 4 star 5. That way it doesn't look like the letter X, so I tend to use the star. You can also use parentheses up against the numbers, 4 parentheses 5. That lack of symbol is multiplication. And you can also have double sets of parentheses. These back-to-back parentheses also mean multiplication. So lots of different ways we're going to see multiplication. The answer for multiplication is called the product. So the product of 4 and 5 is 20. So in this case, the answer 20, we call that the product. The rules for multiplication and dividing are totally different than for adding and subtracting. Adding and subtracting has its set of rules. Multiplying and dividing have a totally different set of rules. So anytime you look at a problem, decide, am I adding and subtracting and using those rules, or am I multiplying and dividing and using those rules? They're totally different. They have nothing to do with each other, and it's very easy to get them mixed up, especially if you have multiplying and subtracting in the same problem, or dividing and adding in the same problem. So you have to just separate those two. Multiplying and dividing, the rules for that, adding and subtracting, separate. So there's a couple different ways to remember the rules for multiplying and dividing. And you can set it up a couple different ways. I've always set it up in a little chart. A student showed me this little tic-tac-toe method, and students have liked that. This little extra line, I'm not sure how it got there. We don't need that, just a little tic-tac-toe board. So I'll show you both. Maybe you already know the rules for multiplying and dividing and you don't need any way to help remember them, but I want to show you both. So this is, again, just for multiplying and dividing. If you're multiplying a positive number times a positive number, your result will be a positive number. If you're multiplying a positive number and a negative number, your answer will be a negative number. If you're multiplying a negative and a positive, same thing, your answer will be negative. And if this is the one that's really different than adding and subtracting, if you have a negative multiplied or divided with another negative, a negative times a negative makes a positive. So you have to keep those very, very separate, very different rules. Another way to write that is a tic-tac-toe chart a student showed me. You start by making a tic-tac-toe grid. You put positives down the diagonal, and you put negatives everywhere else. And every row and every column and the diagonals are all true, which is a little confusing at first, but students really like this. So if you just look at the first row of the tic-tac-toe board, a positive times a negative is a negative. You can even go backwards. A negative times a negative is a positive. Students really like this. On the second row, a negative times a positive is a negative. You can go backwards. A negative times a positive is a negative. Same thing here. Negative times a negative is a positive. Positive times a negative is a negative. Same thing with each column and each diagonal. So students thought that was really cool, and so did I. So you can draw a little tic-tac-toe board if that helps. If that's confusing, don't worry about it. Alright, so let's just practice multiplying. Hopefully your multiplication facts will kind of come back to you as we go through the course. So 7 times negative 2. 7 times 2 is 14. A positive times a negative is a negative, so it'll be negative 14. Negative 5 times negative 5. 5 times 5 is 25. A negative times a negative is a positive, so it'll be a positive 25. Negative 1 times 14. 1 times 14 is 14, but a negative times a positive is a negative. 10 times negative 6. 10 times 6 is 60. A positive times a negative is a negative. And make your negatives very clear so that I can see them, so that you can see them. You enter them correctly on your homework. Let's try again. These are 3. When you have 3 numbers that are all being multiplied together, it doesn't matter which order you go in. We tend to go left to right, but some of you may remember the rule that we do operations inside parentheses first. So you might be inclined to do negative 10 times 2 first, which is negative 20, and 5 times negative 20 would be negative 100. And remember, we have to do all of this without a calculator. So if you're a little shaky on this, go ahead and get those flashcards and practice so it's just easy for you to crank out these answers. Here we'll go left to right. Negative 1 times 8 is negative 8, and then times negative 5. So 8 times 5 is 40. Negative times negative is positive. So your answer would be positive 40. Negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1. So let's do 2 at a time. Negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1. Times another negative 1 will result in negative 1. So don't go too fast through these. Take your time. I always like to write down the first operations answer and then go on to the next one. Here we have parentheses again, so we're inclined to do what's in the parentheses first. Negative 2 times 7 times negative 3 is negative 21, and so negative times a negative would be a positive 42. So you should be able to work these out. It might take you a little bit longer at first, but we really want to get comfortable with our multiplication points. Alright, this is a little bit different. Here we have a different operation inside the parentheses. It's asking us to add 8 plus 7. So we can do that, 15, and multiply that by 3, which is 45. There's another way to do this, but I don't know if it might make it worse. The book talks about distributing that 3 into the parentheses. I think that's more work, so I would suggest doing the operation inside the parentheses first and then multiply the outside. I think that's a little faster. So here we have 6 plus negative 9, which is negative 3, multiplied by 10 would give us negative 30. Here, 4 plus 4 is 8. 8 times negative 6 is negative 48. So take your time, show your steps. So show the little in-between steps. Show as much work as you need. We tend to work underneath each problem and go line by line down if we need to. So just make good habits now of showing your steps. Don't try to do all of this in your head. I don't expect you to do this in your head. You can show as much work as you need. Alright, a couple little reminders at the bottom. Anything multiplied by 0 is 0. Anything multiplied by 1 is itself. So multiplying by 1 doesn't change anything. Multiplying by 0 makes everything 0. So just a couple reminders, quick review on multiplication. Let's move on to division. So section 1.7 is about division. Whoops, there we go. Division is dividing things into groups. So multiplication is putting groups of things together. Dividing is taking those groups back apart. If you know your multiplication facts very well, your division facts will come naturally. However, there are flashcards for division as well, just to practice. You don't want to be stressing out about the arithmetic. You want to make sure you can work through these problems. So flashcards is the quickest way to make sure you know your facts. So dividing is into groups. 3 ways to write division. The classic division symbol, which we'll see a little bit. We don't see it quite as much. You'll see it a little bit at first, and then it will kind of change. The most common way we're going to see division is with the division bar, which makes it look like a fraction, and right now we're not worried about fractions. Just think of this as 6 divided by 2. Then you have the classic, what I call house. I call this the house, where you have kind of the line and then a top, and sometimes it'll extend if your number's bigger. And this is read a little bit backwards. It's 6 divided by 2, or how many times does 2 go into 6? So the bottom number, or the second number, goes on the outside of the house, which is something you'll need later on in 0308. But anyway, the division house is written a little backwards. The top number goes on the inside and the bottom number goes on the outside. So you'll see it written like that occasionally, not too much. One thing I want to point out, and this is a bad habit we get into because we have lined paper, and I used to do this. When you have lined paper, it's very tempting to write your division sideways like that. The problem is, if you're reading back over that, that might look like 612, and you're not quite sure what you were writing. So it's very important to just write a little bit smaller and stack your division bar. Do not slant it. A slanted division bar will just cause you frustration, especially when things get more complicated. You'll be very frustrated that this just doesn't look clear. So practice writing your division stacked properly, and you might just have to write a little bit smaller so that it can fit stacked on a line. So just be careful with that. This is a bad habit we get into, and later on down the road it gets very confusing. All right, and I think I did not put this on here. The answer for division has a very strange name. The answer for division is called the word is very strange, quotient. You might have heard that before. I won't be using that word very much. It's kind of a weird word, quotient, but you'll hear that and you might see that in your textbook, the word quotient. Q-U-O-T-I-E-N-T, quotient. So dividing is the opposite of multiplication. And like I said, if you have all your multiplication facts memorized, you'll know all your division facts. The better you know your multiplication facts, the easier your division is. Alright, so let's just practice some. I have them kind of all mixed in here. 16 divided by 8 is 2. The positive and negative rules still apply here. So negative 15 divided by negative 3 is going to be positive 5. Negative 12 divided by negative 12 will be positive 1. Oh, sorry. Negative 12 divided by positive 4 is negative 3. Positive 5 divided by negative 5 is negative 1. Negative 3 divided by positive 1, negative 3. 12 divided by negative 3 is negative 4. So the positive and negative rules still apply. If both the top and the bottom of the division are negative, it becomes a positive. If only the top or the bottom is negative, it stays negative. So I usually write all my divisions stacked. You'll see a couple homework problems with the old school division symbol. but most of the time we'll be using the stacked format for division. All right, dividing with 0 can be a little tricky here. If I have 0 divided by 4, and that would be if the 0 is first, or if the 0 is in the house. 0 divided by 4. If you do this in the calculator, which you can put this in your phone and see what happens. You won't have your calculator for this part of the test, but 0 divided into 4 groups, if you think about it that way, there will be 0 in each group. It's an answer, you get 0. If you flip that and switch the 4 and the 0 and put the 4 on top and divide by 0, you're trying to take 4 things and divide them into 0 groups, which is impossible. So dividing by 0 is impossible. You cannot have 4 objects or 4 things and divide them into 0 groups, because they already have at least one group of 4. So it's a little abstract, but if you have the 0 on the bottom, or the 0 is second, or the 0 is on the outside of the house, if you were to put this in your phone or put this in your calculator, it would give you an error. It's going to spit out an error. It is impossible to divide by 0. And so we call this undefined. Undefined. So it's very important. These are two totally different ideas. If 0 is on top, the answer is 0. If 0 is first, the answer is 0. If 0 is in the house, the answer is 0. If we switch that, if 0 is on the bottom, if 0 is second, or if 0 is on the outside of the house, the answer is undefined. These are two totally different answers. And so you'll need to find a way to remember if 0 is on top, the answer is 0. If 0 is on the bottom, the answer is undefined. A couple silly ways I've shown students how to do this. If you think of the 4 as 4 little people, so we have 4 little people, and we pretend like those 4 little people are holding up 0, holding up nothing above their head. That's fine. They're just holding up nothing. If you think of it the other way, and this is again a little silly, think of 4 little people. All right. Excuse my little stick figures, 4 little people. And they are, instead of trying to hold up 0, they're trying to stand on 0. They're going to fall. I call that a black hole. If you're trying to stand on nothing, you're trying to stand on 0, you're going to fall. So that's kind of like a black hole. So it's a little silly, but if you think of the number as some people and the 0 as nothing, if there's people trying to hold up nothing, you're fine. If there's people trying to stand on nothing, you're not okay. So just a silly little way to remember. There's lots of other silly ways. We can talk about those in class, but that's one way that I've remembered. If the 0's on the bottom, they're going to fall into a black hole. So just a silly way to remember that. All right, the rest of this page is mixing multiplication and division. And the rule is to work left to right unless, so the only exception, unless there's an operation inside the parentheses. So work left to right unless there is an operation inside the parentheses. So we look at this first problem. We have 60 divided by -3 parentheses -5. Is there an operation, if we cover everything up and look inside the parentheses, is there an operation inside the parentheses? No, there is not. So we're going to do 60 divided by -3 first, which is -20. So we're going to work left to right, and you have to be very careful with this. Then with the -20, we'll bring down multiplying by -5, and the answer is positive 100. If you do that wrong, your answer will be totally off. So the rule is left to right, whichever comes first, left to right, unless there's an actual operation inside those parentheses. So we have to work these very carefully and get the correct answer. If you work these too fast or don't really pay attention to which way you're working them, you'll get a totally different answer. First time I worked this one, I got 4 because I multiplied these guys first and then divided, and that will give you the wrong answer. Let's look at the next one. Find the parentheses. Cover everything else up. Is there an operation inside those parentheses? Yes, there is. There's a division symbol inside the parentheses. So we're going to do negative 16 divided by negative 8, which is positive 2. Then we'll bring down the negative 6 divided by negative 3. Now we're going to work left to right. So negative 6 times 2 is negative 12. And then divided by negative 3 is positive 4. So very, very, very carefully working through these problems. Show as many steps as you can and work down, 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 one operation at a time so that you don't get confused or lost or get it wrong. Alright, the next one. If we look at the first set of parentheses, is there an operation inside? No, there is not. Look at the second set of parentheses. Is there an operation inside? No, there is not. So if there's not an operation inside the parentheses, we just treat those as multiplication. So we're going to work left to right. Negative 8 times 10 is negative 80. We're just going to bring down the next operation, divided by 4. Don't worry about the rest yet. Negative 80 divided by 4 is negative 20. Now we're going to bring down the negative 3, which is positive 60. Then we're going to bring down the divided by negative 6. So work one operation, get the answer, bring the next one down. Work one operation, get the answer, bring the next one down. Positive 60 divided by negative 6 gives us a final answer of negative 10. So you really want to work through these carefully. What I call line by line, show as many steps as you can. When you're at home, do not be tempted to use your phone as a calculator. We will not have a calculator for this test. You need to practice starting with the problem, checking to see if there's an operation inside those parentheses. If not, left to right, one piece at a time. This is making good habits for when we get into solving and when the problems become more complicated. So, given all of that, I will pause there, and then I'll pick up with section 1.5.